Over time, data access has evolved to make working with databases more productive. In the .NET Framework 3.5, we've introduced advanced functionality to make your database manipulation a lot easier. One of these advancements is the Microsoft.NET Language Integrated Query, or LINQ, which allows you to effectively query data in memory. It also allows you to defer loading of data to have the highest performance. LINQ adds native data querying capabilities using a syntax that looks very similar to SQL. We'll be working with LINQ and other advanced data functionalities such as the data grid view control, as well as communicating between various controls on WinForm applications using advanced features. Let's begin. In this lesson, we'll begin by focusing on our grouping entity object. We've already set up item and worked with item, so now let's go ahead and take that one step further. We'll use some advanced functionality to find and search within item, and then we'll add new functionality to not only add items to the database, but also link them with their appropriate groupings. Beyond that, we'll go ahead and work with LINQ to enable your application to have advanced filtering functionality using this new language integrated query. So let's go ahead and add some features to enable data communication between fields as well as adding filtering functionality. Let's begin by configuring our grouping data access architecture. First, let's go into our project files folder and open up chapter 8, open up the anti-curator admin folder, and inside that double-click on the solution file. Navigate to your data sources window. If you don't see the data sources window, select Data, Show Data Sources. Let's go ahead and click on the Add New Data Source button. Select Database, select the inventory connection string, and now let's set a dataset name. Set this to be equal to DS grouping. From the tables, expand, select grouping, and then select the associated link tables for grouping, such as image grouping, as well as item grouping. Select Finish. From your Solution Explorer on the right-hand side of your screen, double-click on DS Grouping. This will pull up the Dataset Designer. As you can see, we can see our 3 associated tables, all pointing to grouping. Let's configure some queries for each of these tables. Find Item Grouping. Right-click, select Add Query, select Next, select Insert, select Next again, and we can pretty much run through this quickly as we've done this before. Change the select into select at identity. Select Next, and let's change the name. Change the name to Insert Item Grouping and return P key. Select Next, and then select Finish. From your Properties window on the lower right-hand side of your screen, select the Execute mode to be Scalar. Now, for the image grouping, let's add a query. Right-click on Image Grouping, select Add Query. Select Next, select Insert, select Next again, and do the same thing. Change the select to be at identity. As you remember from earlier in this series, this will return the primary key for the particular row that you've just inserted. Select Next, and let's change the name. Let's change the name to Insert Image Grouping and return P key. Select Next and Finish. Again, change the Execute mode to be Scalar. Remember that Scalar brings back a single item. In this case, it brings back our primary key. This is the most efficient way of executing an insert query. Now let's go ahead and add a filtered query for the grouping table adapter. Right-click on the grouping table adapter and select Add Query. Select Next again. Click the Query Builder button. What we're going to do is add the item grouping table to create an association using joins between grouping and item grouping. That way, we'll be able to do a filter based on item ID, which is stored in the item grouping table, and return only groups that belong to that item ID. Right-click on the top design surface, select Add Table. Select the item grouping table and click Add. Close the Add Table dialog. You'll see it automatically added an inner join linking the item grouping table together with the grouping table based on grouping ID. Now let's go ahead and add a filter. Type in where item grouping, which is the table, .itemID equals @itemID, which is the parameter that will pass in from the user interface. And that way, by placing in an item ID, we can find out what the associated group is. You'll see how we'll use this later when we build our controls. Select OK. Select Next. Remove the return data table and change the fill by to read Fill Grouping by Item ID. If you haven't noticed already, you'll see that we're being very consistent with our nomenclature for our method names. This way, it'll make it easier to ascertain which method name we need to use when it comes to designing our user interface. Select Next, select Finish. We now have new queries configured for all of our data tables. Now let's work with our user interface. Close this form and click Yes to save the data. Now let's go to the Create Item form. As you remember, so far this allowed us to navigate through all the items in the database. But we'll need to be able to associate an item to a group so that there's no orphaned records in our database. Every item needs to belong to a group when it's first added to the database. We can do this by adding a few more controls using the new DS grouping that we've just configured. At the top of the form, let's drag over a label. Go to your toolbox, scroll down until you see the label control, and drag that above the item ID. Let's change the text value in the Properties window to read Select Group. Next to the label, let's drag over a combo box. From the toolbox, grab the combo box control and drag it over to your screen. Use the alignment tools to align your controls appropriately. Change the size to mirror the sizes of the other controls on the form. This will be visually pleasing for your users. Now we'll need to configure the combo box to iterate through all the groups in the database, allowing us to select the appropriate one for the item that we wish to add. We can do this using data binding. Many controls have the ability to bind data directly to a data source, such as an object or a data set. In your Properties window, scroll up to the data source property. Select the drop-down button. Under Other Data Sources, Project Data Sources, you'll find the DS grouping. Expand that. You'll see the 3 tables that we've added under DS grouping. Select the grouping table. Now that we have a data source, the grouping data table, we'll now want to display some data from that table. Automatically, Visual Studio will iterate through all the columns available in that table. The display member sets the property for what the user is going to see. Ideally, you want the user to see something friendly, in this case, the name. However, behind the scenes, when you're actually working with manipulating and retrieving data, you'll probably want to use the primary key, in this case, the grouping ID. That way, you'll pass a unique piece of data into your query to return data based on your query results. We can do this by using the value member property. Scroll down to the value member. The value member is the hidden property that's actually going to be sent and manipulated and passed around inside the combo box. Change this to be grouping ID. Lastly, let's give our combo box a name. Change combo box 1 at the top of the Properties window to be combo box grouping. Save all your changes. Press F7 to go to the code view. Scroll down. As you remember, we had added the position changed event to our item binding source. The position changed event fires every time the position of a row changes. In this event, what we had configured was filling the images for the item. Now we'll also have to configure changing the group based on the item. Let's add some logic to do so. Above the try, let's add a member variable to track the item ID itself. We'll then use the item ID to return the group associated to this item ID. You'll remember that we added the fill grouping by item ID method back earlier in this chapter. This is the same method that we'll use to go ahead and return data or the group based on the item ID. Let's set an integer variable called item ID. Type in int _ item ID semicolon. Now inside the try, you'll find the if statement. As you see, it fills the images by item ID. Let's do a little bit more. After this line of code, type in item ID equals convert to int 32 item ID label.text. This will take the item ID from the label, convert it to an integer, and store it into our parameter. Now we'll go ahead and fill the grouping data. Type in this.grouping table adapter .fill grouping by item ID and pass in the dsgrouping.grouping, which is our data set, and then also the second parameter is the item ID. This will fill a grouping data set with data based on results returned from a successful match of item ID. Save all your changes.